This lecture is on the background and early developments in the Fertile Crescent. So the first thing we need to do is explain a little bit about what we mean by the term Fertile Crescent, as well as the terms Mesopotamia and Sumer. These will pop up throughout this section. So first of all, the Fertile Crescent is the biggest of these three geographic units we're going to be talking about, and it runs from here, like this. It makes the shape of a crescent. Right? It looks similar to a crescent moon. That's why it's called the crescent. And it's called the Fertile Crescent because this is a place where it's really good to grow food. And some early civilizations are going to grow up there. So fairly clear, I think. Fertile Crescent because it's shaped like a crescent. And this crescent-shaped area is rather fertile. The area of Mesopotamia is a smaller part of the Fertile Crescent. This area here. Mesopotamia literally means the area between two rivers. What two rivers? The Tigris and the Euphrates. So this bit is Mesopotamia here. Sumer, what we may call the cradle of civilization, because that's where these early city-states and kingdoms will begin, is just this little section here. So Sumer is a part of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a part of the Fertile Crescent. So those are some geographic terms we'll be using. Just want to make sure that you get what those are. Now, you can again see in this map what we were talking about. I'd like to use two maps to make it a little bit more clear. Egypt, modern-day Israel and Palestine, and then Mesopotamia here, Sumer here. All this makes the Fertile Crescent. But why here, right? Why do the early civilizations that we know of begin in this area, particularly down here in Sumer? Well, first of all, there were a large amount of crops that could be domesticated, particularly wheat, right? If you are human beings who are hunter-gatherers and you're in an area that doesn't have crops that are easy to domesticate, to grow and to cultivate and to harvest, you're not going to be able to move to farming. But here there were crops that were relatively easy to domesticate. Similarly, there were animals that could be easily domesticated. So, for example, if you read the Bible, they talk a lot about things like herds, especially herds of sheep and goats. Sheep are pretty easy to domesticate, as are goats. Larger animals are more dangerous. And it's helpful if you have smaller animals that are relatively harmless, like sheep, that you can domesticate first, and then you can move on to the bigger ones later. So you can see here that they have some of the basic resources necessary to have increased food production. Remember, that's the foundation of civilization, increased food production. In addition, there are rivers that provide lots of water, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, but these rivers periodically flood, and they put out silt that is full of nutrients that plants need to live. So they help make the soil fertile. Well, human beings, crops, and animals all need water. So these are some ideal areas, right? Notice that this is a good place between two rivers, right? That's a good place to get lots of fresh water and to get fertile soil to use to take care of your crops and animals. And of course, Egypt is sometimes referred to as the gift of the Nile because it could not have existed without the Nile River. So you put all these things together and you get a food surplus, right? This enables a food surplus. So you have people able to grow more food than is strictly necessary. So that means some people can do other things other than grow food. If we have people who are able to grow so much food that they can't possibly eat all of it, we have other people who then can do other things. They can make things, for example, we talked about this like pots and spears, and then trade that for the food that other people are producing. And of course, as we'll talk about, this also allows for people to be priests or kings or merchants, things like that. So together, now that we have this food surplus, we have this increased agricultural productivity, we can now have specialization. We can have people we can have people doing things other than growing food, and this also leads to population density. What this means is you can have a lot of people living in a smaller area because the people in the surrounding area are able to produce plenty of food to feed those people. In other words, you can have cities, people where tens of thousands of people may live, who are able to produce things and that they can trade and be supported by people in the countryside, right? But again, notice, and remember, civilization comes from a word connected to cities. Once we have good food production, that allows specialization, that allows people to live in cities and do lots of interesting things. Now, one thing I also want to stress that's very important about what happens in Mesopotamia is their knowledge of the domestication of crops and animals will spread outside of this area. So while we're going to focus on Mesopotamia and try and understand some themes in world history in this section, it's important to note that what they're figuring out, these crops, these animals, and so forth, they're going to spread out. And of course, this is also true of Egypt as well. So one of the very important characteristics of Mesopotamia is its religion. Now, one thing you can tell about how a civilization values things is what are its biggest, most impressive buildings. So, for example, in the United States, a lot of times our biggest, most impressive buildings are connected to business, which makes sense for how our country works, right? It's a country that emphasizes economic opportunity, capitalism, and so forth. So our biggest buildings tend to be skyscrapers connected to business. In medieval Europe, of course, the biggest buildings would have been cathedrals, right? Churches, showing how this was an age of faith. Well, Mesopotamia was more similar to medieval Europe than it is to modern day United States. Their largest buildings, at least initially, we'll talk more about how things change later, were these things called ziggurats. All right, this is a ziggurat. It is what's called a step pyramid. Basically, they would build one layer, and then later on when they got some more money, they would build another layer, and they would keep on going. But ziggurats were religious temples, right? These are religious buildings. And in the earliest cities of Sumer, of Mesopotamia, these were the largest buildings. Now, in this time period, it was just taken for granted that there were gods and that they governed the world. Why does it rain? Well, the gods make it rain. Why does it not rain during a time period, right? Well, maybe we made the gods angry. Why is it, and so they're not letting it rain. Why is it raining too much? Well, we did something to make the gods really angry, so it's not raining. And in a sense, for us, you kind of have a choice to be, if you want to be a religious person, you can. If you don't, you can still explain why things happen, right? You can say, well, it rains because of certain atmospheric conditions. But in this time period, there was no real alternate explanation. Why does it rain? Well, it's the gods. Why does anything happen? Well, it's the result of the gods governing the world. And you can get, in a society in which it's just assumed that the gods exist, no one really questions it, and they're believed to be powerful and active in the world, well, it makes sense that priests would be very important people, and that temples where the gods are worshipped would be very large and very impressive. And in particular, of course, the people of Mesopotamia believed that the gods could bring order to society, to the world, and could also bring blessings if they were happy. You pray to the gods, you have festivals for the gods, that keeps the gods happy, everything's fine. In contrast, if you make the gods angry, that creates disorder, they may curse you. And the classic example from Mesopotamian religion is that basically the gods were trying to sleep, and human beings had a big party and kept waking up the gods, and so the gods killed us all with a massive flood. So, and one thing I want to stress, there's a theological connection between the Tigris and Euphrates, those rivers in Mesopotamia, and their beliefs about the gods. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and we'll talk more about this later, they flood all the time, kind of randomly, and at different levels. So it was really difficult to predict when a flood might happen. And so that led the people of Mesopotamia to believe the gods were really easy to make angry. Right? They thought the gods were kind of capricious, were angry, and so forth. And they had that connection from the rivers, right? The rivers seem to flood at any time for no apparent reason. Well, that's because we're making the gods angry. The gods are capricious. They're really easy to get mad. So it makes sense then that you want to support priests who can perform rituals to help keep the gods happy. So religion is extraordinarily important in Mesopotamia. What's also important is the rise of governments, what I'm going to refer to as a state. I will usually say state instead of government, but they're basically synonyms. But I want to stress, when I say state, don't think like the United States or something like that, like a part of the United States, I want you to think government. And it's key that I explain, right? I just explained, about how Mesopotamian religion works. I also need to explain what I mean by a state. So a state is a set of connected institutions that maintain sole control over a particular territory. So there's a Canadian state, and they control the territory of Canada. The United States of America, our government, which is made up of multiple institutions, you can kind of think about their state, federal, local governments. There's also the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Those connected institutions maintain sole control over the United States of America. The USA does not control parts of Canada. Canada does not control parts of the USA. So that's what I mean by that. It is the duty of that government to defend the territory they maintain control over, at least they claim to maintain control over, from foreign invasion. That'd be an external threat. And from internal threats such as criminals like bandits and rebels. In addition, typically governments administer the territory through a bureaucracy. These are officials who serve the state. So this is where things are a little bit different from, say, a tribal level of organization where everyone's kind of related and you kind of obey someone because, oh yeah, that's my uncle, or, that's my dad or my granddad, or, that's my cousin. So I maybe don't have to do what he says, but if all of the other cousins get together, I kind of have to. This is a lot more complex, right? Has a lot more people. And so you need specialized government officials like bureaucrats to administer the territory. Ideally, the state also carries out work for the public good. What I mean by public good, something that benefits pretty much everyone. So, for example, building roads. That's the kind of thing states do. To a certain extent, they may provide education or something like that. But a state also is supposed to do something good for the people it governs. It therefore is thought to have the right to tax people in order to obtain resources, in order to carry out those works, right? You need an army, so you got to raise to protect people. You got to have taxes. You need money to build roads. Now, in ancient societies, one thing that makes them a little bit different is a lot of times when they paid their taxes, well, it could be in money. Sometimes it was in food, like they would have to give a certain amount of their grain harvest to the government. In other cases, they actually had to provide labor. So you might have to go work for the government for free for like a month, or for a very low price, or they would just feed you or something. But the key thing is the government has a job, or rather multiple jobs, and therefore can tax people to do these things, but the people are supposed to accept paying the taxes because ideally those taxes are being used to help the people, making things like armies to protect them and roads and so forth. In addition, governments are in charge of administering justice typically. Often this is through a law code. And in one side, we can think of this morally, like I said, administering justice. We could also think of it in a more morally objective way, or morally neutral, I should say, and say the government is supposed to resolve conflict between people. So that's what I mean when I say state. Now, I do want to point out there's one other thing we need to talk about, and that's a city-state, which is basically when you have a state that consists of one city and the surrounding territory. Right? A city-state consists of one city and the surrounding territory. So how do we get governments? How do we make that move from a tribal level of organization or something like that to a state? Well, in Mesopotamia, it is thought that this was the result of the need for complex irrigation and flood control. So one thing you know about Mesopotamia, when we looked at that map, did you notice it was roughly about where Iraq is? And there's a lot of desert in Iraq? Well, there's a lot of desert in Iraq. And so you have rivers, but a lot of the territory around the rivers is dry. So you need to have irrigation. Now, remember, I said that these waters flooded a lot. The rivers flood a lot. So you need to do things like build dams and levees in order to prevent in order to reduce the damage that flooding might cause. So basically, you need to be able to, in order for this farming to work, you need to control these rivers that are very dangerous and that flood whenever they want. You need to make sure you have enough water, but not too much, even when it floods. And so you need to do things, like I said, like build dams, levees, reservoirs, and of course you have to build the actual irrigation works, right, that bring the water to the fields. To do all that, you have to mobilize people and you have to organize it. You got to get people together and say, okay, we're going to build this stuff. And then you have to organize it. Okay, you guys are building the dam. Your job is to move the dirt. Your job is to do the digging. Your job is to, set out where we're going to actually build it and so forth. So you have to mobilize and organize a lot of people to do this. And the problem is, you know what? Work is hard. Who wants to work? So you can kind of think about it this way. You may, in the dorms, have a shared space. And people might keep their individual rooms clean, but they may not keep the kitchen clean. Right? And everyone agrees that the kitchen needs to be kept clean, but no one wants to be the one that does it. And they may say, well, it's my turn, or it's your turn. I did it last time. Why aren't you doing it? Well, I had to study. I've been busy, whatever. The fact is, people will often all agree that something is for the public good. They'll say, this is a good thing. We should totally have it. We should totally do it. But then when it's time to actually do the work, no one wants to do the work. So work is hard. People agree that it needs to be done, but of course they don't want to be the ones to do it. So you have to have someone who can organize all this work, mobilize these people, and make people do the work. Initially, it was religious leaders who did this. At first, it was the priests. And basically, it kind of makes sense, right? Because they can say to people, look, the gods want this to be done, and we all know the gods exist. And you know that I speak for the gods because I'm a priest. And if it's not done, the gods are going to punish us. There's going to be a bad flood. And of course, there's a place where it floods all the time. So eventually there would be a bad flood or something, right? So initially it was religious leaders who do this. And one thing I want to point out that we're going to notice in ancient societies, it's different. We're used to thinking Americans, even though Americans have pretty high rates of religious belief and religious activity, even religious Americans do think there should be a separation between church and state. They just agree, religious and non-religious people just often disagree about where that line of separation should be. But as we'll see throughout history, in this ancient history and into the early modern period where this class ends, most people don't think in those terms. Religion is something that's just an accepted part of life, goes all throughout life. The idea of having some kind of strict separation is foreign. And so this goes to the question of legitimacy, right? So we had this question, why do people accept a state as legitimate? What makes people do what they're told to do by a government, even when they may not want to? So to give you an example, who wants to pay taxes? No one wants to pay taxes. Again, everyone would agree we need the things that taxes pay for, but no one wants to pay taxes. If I were to tell you you have to pay a tax to stay in this course, you would complain, rightfully so. You would say, what right do you have to tax us? You have no legitimate right to tax us, right? Because I'm just a person. But a government is accepted as having the right to tax. In the United States government, the right to tax can be kind of seen in the idea of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union. That's how it begins, right? The Constitution. Power in the United States comes from the people. Why do we do what the government says? Well, it's the government we elected. And even if it's not the particular person you voted for, it's still understood, well, this is a democracy. I lost the election, majority rules. I'll just need to work harder next time. That's how we do things. So we're willing to accept our government as legitimate because it's a democracy. We understand its power coming from us. In ancient civilizations, such as what we're talking about here, it's very different. It's understood, it's believed that the legitimacy comes from the gods, in a sense. So, for example, this is Marduk, the chief deity of Babylon. We'll talk more about him later. But it's understood, well, I pay taxes to the government because the gods want me to. And the gods instituted this government. The king and the priests who work with the king, I'll get to this momentarily, are representatives of the gods, so I need to do what they say. So like I said, in the United States, you don't have to send soldiers around to force people to pay their taxes. We do so generally willingly, even if we don't like to. because we accept this as part of our government. In ancient civilization, it's very different, right? It has to do more with the connection to the gods. So where do we get kings then? Right? How do kings come about? Well, it's not quite clear, but eventually you're going to have a competitor with the priests as well as a partner. So this is a ziggurat. This is the king's palace. Like I said, initially you start off with just ziggurats, with just these religious temples. The priests are kind of in charge, and they have to be in order to, deal with the flooding. But later there seems to be a rise of kings. It's not clear. That might have been specialization. Things maybe got so complex there was too much work for the priests to do, and they needed someone to help them, and that would be the kings. It could have been the fact that the kings could have been earlier people who were in charge of the military. We'll talk more about the military later. But maybe they used their military power to seize power. Maybe the kings, or these military leaders, worked with the priests peacefully, and over time those military leaders became kings. It's not clear. But in any case, we have the rise increasingly of kings, political leaders, who are not performing religious rituals typically. They may perform some, but that's not their main job. Their main job is to govern. So now we have a church and state, in a sense. Now we have a church and state. But don't think they're separate. They're connected. Why? Well, for one thing, the priests crown the kings. So when you became king, you had a ritual in which you were crowned by the priests. And kings were believed, through, in a sense, that crowning, to have a special relationship with the gods. That gives them legitimacy. Why do you have the right to rule me? Why do you have the right to collect taxes from me? Well, the gods who control the world have chosen me, and I have a special relationship with them, in part thanks to the priests, and that's why you should do what I say. In addition, the king protected the temples and those who served in them. So the king had a practical job. And that helped cement this idea that the kings had a special relationship with the gods, so the protectors of the temples, the holy places of the gods. Now, one thing I want to stress, in Sumer and in Mesopotamia, each city-state had its own patron god. This is a polytheistic religious system. There's lots of different gods, and you could worship a lot of different gods, but each city-state had a special god that was like their guardian, their protector, their patron. And the king was thought to be specifically connected to that god. And this cosmic connection says basically, you know what, there's something right about the king ruling. There's something morally, cosmically right. The gods are the ones that bring rain, that make it so we have crops and all those wonderful things. They're the ones who have made it so this person is in charge of us. The priests have confirmed that, so we should accept the king as having the right to rule. Now, we want to state this isn't absolute. Remember I said each city-state had its own patron god, and it was believed that whenever a war on earth happened, and we'll talk about this later, there were lots of wars, between two city-states, it was also believed that a war was also occurring in heaven between the gods. And whoever won in heaven, so you'd have the two gods, each representing one city-state, fighting each other, possibly some heavenly RVs involved too. Whichever one of those gods won, that god's forces on earth would also win the war. And of course, when you won, you would destroy enemy temples to show that your god was bigger and better than their god. You're not saying that their god does not exist. You're just saying that your god is more powerful. So we've seen here several different things. We have understood how geography has shaped this area and helped lead to the rise of a powerful priesthood. We've also seen religious beliefs and their connection to kingship. We've also highlighted how there are issues of war, something which we'll be talking about later.